For this lesson, we show how to stitch the main shell of a jacket. We share some tips and tricks about how to prepare the patterns before stitching, and we also run through the stitching process. Since there are layers to this garment, we first hide the lining and facing layer from the 3D window before stitching. We select all the lining and facing patterns. Then we go to the context view under Draping Properties and clear the Use in 3D property. To make the 2D window less cluttered, we can also select the fusing patterns at the top and bottom and hide them for the time being. Before we start stitching, let's look at a few things we need to adjust for the patterns to make the stitching process smoother. It's worthwhile thinking about adjusting the pattern pieces in the 2D CAD software so things go quicker the next time. Here we have a dart along the front which connects to the dart on the side seam. This is where the jetted welt pockets will be stitched. We need to cut out the pocket opening before stitching the jetted pocket pieces on. The dart along the middle of the pattern is an irregular dart. It starts as parallel, then goes into a pointed triangle at the tip of the dart. Thus, we will not be able to use the Insert Dart option. If the dart is regular, rounded or curved shaped dart, we can make use of the Insert Dart option. In this case, we need to make a cutout where the dart is. To do so, we can use the following method. Before we cut out the pattern, we want to create the welt patterns for the jetted pocket. We select the internal line marking to check the width and length of the pieces. We need to insert a rectangle that is 15.2 centimeters by 0.5 centimeters. Then we clone it, so we have one piece for the top and one for the bottom. Now we select the two pieces and create X symmetry for the other side of the jacket. It's important to note that the jetted pockets extend over the side bodice. If we look at the side bodice pattern now, it does not have the internal line positioning for the pocket, except for the notch. To mark the side bodice, we drag the side bodice pattern to match the notch with this point on the front bodice along the side seam. With the gizmo tool enabled, we select the side bodice, then drag the gizmo to the notch point. To see the edges and internal lines more clearly, we can also turn off the textures. If the patterns turn blue after turning off textures, it means that the seam allowance option also needs to be disabled. Using the gizmo, we rotate the pattern so the edges are aligned like this. We need to trace the internal lines for the pocket from the front bodice to the side bodice. Let's recall how to do this. Do we A, select the internal lines, then select Trace as Internal Line on the context view, or B, select the internal lines, convert them to floating lines first, then trace them as internal lines again. The correct answer is B. Once we have multi-selected the internal lines, we go to the context view and click Convert Internal Lines to Floating Line. We select the floating lines again and convert them back to internal lines. The internal lines for the jetted pocket are copied over to the side bodice as well. We rotate the side bodice back. Once we trace the internal line, we want to make sure that the internal lines also appear on the other side of the side bodice pattern. If not showing, we select the internal lines and under Line Properties ensure that Symmetry is selected. We need to create a cutout where the jetted welt pockets will be stitched as well as the dart on the front bodice. We start with the front pattern first. Before we adjust the pattern, we turn on Trace Changes in the 2D window so that we have an outline of the original pattern just in case. We start by dragging the corner point to match the outline of the bottom welt. Snap to point and edge can help to ensure the points aligned with the internal lines. We can also zoom into points for easier alignment. With the pen tool and edit points enabled, we add one point on the top dart leg. We change it to Sharp Point and add a corner point. Now we drag it to the top marking for the welt. Since the dart opening is slanted, we also need to move this point on the side seam up. Clicking on the marking for the welt, we can see that the pocket opening is 1 centimeter in width, so it means that we have to move this point up by 0.5 centimeters. We click the point, then select the measurement display in the 2D window. We type in minus 0.5 centimeters, then enter. Next, we can delete the internal line markings for the welt to avoid confusion when stitching. With a pen tool, and snap to center enabled, we add a corner point along the width of the welt opening. This makes for easier stitching later. Now we need to cut out the dart. We select the two internal lines which mark the dart legs. Then go to the context view and click Slice. Then we delete the unnecessary pattern piece for both the right and left front bodice pattern. The last step is to cut out the side bodice pattern. We select these two lines and slice the pattern. Next, we delete the part we sliced out for both sides of the side bodice. We ensure that the points are corner points. Then we add another corner point in the center of this edge. We are now ready to stitch the shell together. If you need more time to go over the pattern adjustments, you can pause the lesson here and complete it before moving on. With your knowledge, we want you to try stitching the garment first before viewing the next part of the video. As a start, we can leave out stitching the vents on the sleeves and back bodice. You can pause the lesson here to give it a try. Or you can continue watching and stitch the garment along the way. We start off by stitching the bodice patterns together. We stitch the shoulder seams, then we go around the avatar and stitch the following: the front bodice to the side bodice. We include the small edges at the bottom of the hem facing. Back bodice to side bodice. The center back bodice. Then we repeat the same thing for the other side. On the front bodice, we stitch the darts close. Now we need to stitch the jetted pocket and the flap. We must first arrange the welt patterns into the front torso cluster together with the rest of the shell patterns. Since the patterns are small, we will do this in the 2D window. Since the pocket flap patterns need to be sitting in between the top and bottom welts, we need to adjust the layers. The bottom welt is on layer 2, so we change it to be higher than the bodice pattern, which would be layer 6. The pocket flap would be layer 7, and the top welt pattern would be layer 8. We must remember to adjust the 3D layers of those pocket patterns for the other side of the jacket. We use multi-stitch to stitch the jetted welt patterns and pocket flap to the edges of the pocket opening. The flap should be stitched to the top edge of the pocket opening, or the top edge of the jetted welt pattern. Now we stitch the welt pattern on the wearer's left chest. Next, we need to stitch the sleeves to the bodice. Depending on the design of the jacket, we need to take note where the sleeve edges connect to the armhole. We can use the notches as a guide. If you want to match the different segments of the sleeve with their assigned ease to the corresponding segments of the armhole, we recommend turning notches into corner points and using single stitch. Using multi-stitch for the whole armhole would distribute the ease of the whole sleeve evenly across the armhole. Depending on the outlook of our sleeve construction, either way can work. For our example, we take the first option. Let's change the notch points on the armhole and sleeve cap to corner points. We mustn't forget to change the notch on the other side of the back bodice. For this jacket, the top sleeve is joined to the front bodice panel. So we start stitching that first and go around the sleeve. We need to remember that since the back patterns are not symmetrical, the other side of the back armhole will not be stitched to the top sleeve. We manually stitch those edges together. Then we stitch the top sleeve to the bottom sleeve. as well as the inseam of the sleeve patterns. Now stitching is complete. To check if we have stitched correctly, we can dress the garment. But before that, we can enable constrained area to the arm clusters so that the sleeves won't get stuck into the fingers of the avatar. If there are any collisions, we check that the stitches are correct and restitch as needed. If there are missing stitches, we can go ahead and stitch them. For example, we have missed out the front bodice dart. One thing we can do to rectify the stitching in the 3D window is to check that the notches align. If they don't, then we change the notch points to corner points and perform a single stitch instead, as we have done for the sleeve cap. And the stitching looks good, and we are complete. Remember to save your files before moving to the next lesson.